So there is a meeting that took place inside Buckingham Palace last week that the royal family does not want you to know about. And the reason they do not want you to know about it is not because something embarrassing happened. It is because what happened in that room revealed fractures inside the Windsor family that go so deep, so far back, and cut so close to the future of the monarchy itself that every person who walked out of that meeting understood one thing with absolute clarity. The institution they were all sworn to protect was being torn apart, not by the press, not by public opinion, not by Harry or Meghan or any external threat. It was being torn apart by the people sitting around that table. And the person who finally lost his composure, the person who stood up in a room full of senior royals and senior advisors and said what no one else was willing to say out loud, was Prince William, the heir to the throne, the man who has spent his entire adult life being the most controlled, the most measured, the most deliberately calm person in every room he enters. That William. He did not raise his voice slightly. He did not express polite disagreement in firm tones. He exploded. And the reason he exploded is a story that begins not with anger, but with patience. Years and years of patience. The kind of patience that builds pressure so slowly, you do not realize the walls are cracking until the entire structure gives way at once. Let me take you into the room. The meeting was convened by the King's private secretary at Charles's direct instruction. It was not a casual family check-in. It was not one of those seasonal gatherings where royals exchange pleasantries over tea and pretend that everything is running smoothly. This was an operational meeting, a working session designed to resolve a specific set of disputes about ceremonial responsibilities, public engagement schedules, and the allocation of patronages for the coming year. Patronages are the charitable organizations, military affiliations, and institutional relationships that senior royals hold in their official capacity. They are not decorative. They carry real influence, real obligations, and real prestige. When a patronage is assigned or reassigned, it signals where the palace believes authority and public trust should be concentrated. And the reassignment of patronages has historically been one of the most quietly vicious battlegrounds inside the royal family because it determines who matters, who is visible, and who is being gradually phased out. The room included Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and a small group of senior palace officials, including the King's private secretary and the Lord Chamberlain, who oversees the royal household's ceremonial and administrative operations. This was not an informal family dinner. This was the monarchy's internal government sitting down to make binding decisions about how the institution would present itself to the public for the next 12 months. The first hour went the way these meetings usually go. Detailed, bureaucratic, occasionally tedious. Schedules were reviewed. Overseas tour proposals were discussed. A disagreement about the timing of a state banquet was resolved without difficulty. Anne made a dry comment about the number of engagements assigned to her compared to everyone else in the room, and the tension broke briefly into something that almost resembled warmth. Edward asked a procedural question about Commonwealth Day planning that was answered efficiently by the Lord Chamberlain. Catherine reviewed a briefing document about a children's mental health initiative she had been developing for months and received unanimous support to expand it. And then Camilla spoke, and everything changed. She had been quiet for most of the first hour, not withdrawn, not disengaged. Quiet in the way that a person is quiet when they are waiting for the right moment to introduce something they know will be controversial. She had a folder in front of her that she had not opened during any of the earlier discussions. When the agenda moved to the section on patronage reassignments, she placed both hands on the folder, looked directly at the King's private secretary, and said she had a formal request to submit before the discussion continued. The room went still. not because a formal request was unusual, but because of the way she said it. The language was precise, rehearsed, and delivered with the kind of composure that only comes from someone who has practiced the sentence enough times to remove every trace of hesitation from it. She was not improvising. She had prepared for this moment, and the preparation itself told everyone in the room that whatever was inside that folder was going to be a problem. Charles glanced at his private secretary. The secretary's expression did not change, which meant he had not been briefed on whatever Camilla was about to present. That detail is important because it meant Camilla had deliberately bypassed the king's office. She had not submitted her request through the normal channels where it would have been reviewed, adjusted, and potentially softened before reaching the full group. She had waited until the entire room was assembled and then introduced it without warning. That is not how the palace operates. The palace operates on preparation, consensus building, and the careful elimination of surprises. Surprises in a room full of senior royals are not spontaneous. They are tactical. Camilla opened the folder. She distributed a single-page document to each person at the table. The document outlined a proposal to create what she described as an expanded ceremonial portfolio for the Queen Consort. The portfolio would consolidate several existing patronages currently held by other senior royals under Camilla's direct authority. It would grant her a formalized role in all state banquet planning, give her advisory input on the guest list for major palace events, and establish her as the ceremonial lead for a new annual Commonwealth Women's Initiative that would carry the Queen Consort's personal endorsement. On the surface, the proposal looked administrative, reasonable even, a Queen Consort consolidating her public role and attaching her name to a meaningful cause. But everyone in that room understood what the document actually represented. It was a power grab, a carefully structured, meticulously worded attempt to permanently expand Camilla's institutional footprint in a way that would make her influence nearly impossible to reverse when the reign changed hands. Because once patronages are consolidated under a single office, once ceremonial authority is formalized in writing, once advisory roles are attached to state functions, those structures take on institutional momentum. They become precedent, and precedent inside the monarchy is almost as powerful as law. Anne was the first to react. She looked up from the document, set it down on the table, and asked a single question. She asked whether the patronages listed in the proposed consolidation included any that were currently assigned to the Princess of Wales. The room held its breath because the answer to that question would determine whether this was a routine administrative proposal or a direct challenge to Catherine's position. Camilla answered without hesitation. She said that several of the patronages listed were currently shared between multiple offices and that consolidation would improve efficiency and public clarity. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She gave an answer designed to obscure the fact that the answer was yes. 3 of the patronages listed in her proposal were currently under Catherine's office. 2 others were jointly managed by Catherine and Anne. The consolidation would transfer all 5 to the Queen Consort's authority. William had been reading the document while Anne asked her question. He finished the page. He set it down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. He placed his pen on top of it. And then he looked across the table at Camilla and asked whether she had discussed this proposal with Catherine before presenting it to the group. Camilla said she had not. She explained that the proposal was being submitted to the king for review and that individual consultations would follow if the proposal received preliminary approval. That answer was technically correct and strategically devastating because what she was saying, translated from palace language into plain English, was that she intended to secure the king's endorsement first and then present Catherine with a decision that had already been approved at the highest level. She was not asking for Catherine's input. She was planning to inform her after the fact. William's jaw tightened. Catherine placed her hand briefly on his forearm beneath the table. That gesture, invisible to most of the room but noticed by at least 2 people present, was not a request for calm. It was an acknowledgement that she understood what was happening and that she trusted him to handle it. She was not holding him back. She was letting him know that whatever he decided to do next, she was with him. William looked at his father. Charles had been reading the document with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that every micro-expression in this room was being catalogued and would be reported. His face gave nothing away, but his silence was its own communication, because a king who supported his wife's proposal would have signaled that support immediately. The fact that Charles said nothing meant one of two things. Either he had not been consulted, which would mean Camilla had gone around him entirely, or he had been consulted privately, disagreed, and was watching to see how the room responded before committing to a position. Neither option was good for Camilla. William asked Charles directly. He asked whether the king had reviewed this proposal before today's meeting. Charles answered that he had seen an early version, but had not approved it for formal submission. That answer detonated in the room like a controlled explosion, because it meant Camilla had taken a draft that Charles had seen, but not endorsed, and presented it to the full working group as though it carried royal authority. She had leveraged the fact that Charles had seen the document to imply approval without ever receiving it, and that is when William's composure broke. Before we go further, real quick, if you are into deep dives on royal stories that actually sit with the complexity instead of just picking a side, hit subscribe and join us here at Crown Watch. We are building something good. Okay, back to it. He did not shout. Not at first. He stood up, which in a formal palace meeting is itself a statement because these meetings operate on rigid protocol, and standing, while others remain seated signals that the speaker is no longer participating in discussion. They are delivering a verdict. William told the room that the proposal was unacceptable. Not parts of it, not the timing of it, not the way it had been presented, the entire thing. He said that no senior royal should be consolidating patronages that belonged to the next generation's portfolio without the explicit written agreement of the people whose authority would be diminished. He said that efficiency was not a justification for concentration of power, and that anyone who had studied the monarchy's history knew that concentrated ceremonial authority in the hands of one person outside the direct line of succession had never ended well for the institution. Then he turned to Camilla and said what no one else in the room was willing to say. He told her that the proposal was not about the Commonwealth, it was not about women's initiatives, it was not about streamlining patronages or improving public clarity. It was about securing a foothold so deep inside the institution's structure that it could not be removed when the reign changed. And he told her directly and without diplomatic softening that he would not allow it. His voice rose during the last sentence, not to a shout, but to a register that everyone in the room recognized as something they had never heard from William before. A register that carried genuine fury underneath the words, the kind of fury that comes not from a single provocation, but from the accumulated weight of years of watching someone push boundaries that they were supposed to respect. Camilla did not retreat. She matched his intensity with her own. She told William that she had earned her position through decades of service, and that she would not be treated as a temporary placeholder who could be discarded the moment the heir decided her time was up. She said that her contributions to the monarchy were real, that her sacrifices were real, and that she would not sit quietly while her role was reduced to a ceremonial afterthought designed to make the transition to the next reign as seamless and painless as possible for everyone except her. The room fractured. Anne set her jaw and stared at a point on the far wall with an expression that those who know her recognized as the face she makes when she is deciding whether to intervene or allow a situation to reach its natural conclusion. Edward shifted uncomfortably and looked toward the king's private secretary for guidance that did not come. Catherine sat motionless, her posture perfect, her expression composed, her eyes moving between William and Camilla with the focus of someone who was cataloging every word for later analysis. Charles finally spoke. and what he said did not help. He asked William to sit down. That request, delivered in the measured tone of a father addressing a son rather than the commanding voice of a king addressing his heir, made things worse, because it framed William's objection as an emotional outburst rather than a constitutional argument. And William heard it exactly that way. He remained standing. He looked at his father and said something that multiple accounts have confirmed, and that carries a weight far beyond the room where it was spoken. He said that the monarchy would not survive another generation of decisions made to avoid uncomfortable conversations. He said that his grandmother had understood that restraint was not the same as avoidance, and that the difference between the two had kept the institution intact for 70 years. And then he said that if the current reign could not draw clear boundaries around the next reign's authority, then the next reign would draw them itself. That statement was not a threat. It was a declaration of intent. William was telling the room, telling his father, telling Camilla, telling every advisor and official present that the era of negotiated ambiguity was over. The next reign would not be shaped by inherited compromises, unresolved disputes, or the accumulated weight of decisions that previous monarchs had been too cautious or too kind to make. It would be shaped by the people who would carry it forward, and those people would not accept boundaries drawn by anyone else. Charles absorbed the statement without visible reaction, but the private secretary later noted that the king's right hand, resting on the table beside his briefing folder, pressed flat against the surface hard enough to whiten his knuckles. That physical detail communicates more than any official statement could. Charles was not angry at his son. He was absorbing the reality that his heir had just claimed authority over territory that the current reign had not yet formally released. Camilla attempted to reframe the conversation. She addressed Anne directly, bypassing both William and Charles, and asked whether the Princess Royal believed the proposal had merit on its own terms, regardless of the political dynamics in the room. It was a clever move because Anne's opinion carried enormous institutional weight. If Anne endorsed even a portion of the proposal, Camilla could argue that the objections were personal rather than constitutional. Anne looked at Camilla for a long moment. Then she said something that cut through every layer of strategy and counter-strategy in the room. She said that their mother had held patronages for 70 years without ever once consolidating them under a single expanded portfolio. She said that Elizabeth had believed patronages worked best when they were distributed widely because distribution created accountability, and accountability prevented any single member of the family from accumulating influence that exceeded their constitutional role. Then Anne picked up Camilla's document, folded it once, and placed it in the center of the table. The gesture was unmistakable. She was returning the proposal, not rejecting it formally, returning it. The distinction mattered because a formal rejection would have been adversarial. A return suggested that the proposal had been received, considered, and found unnecessary. It was Anne's way of saying no without creating an enemy. Edward followed Anne's lead. He told the room that he supported the existing patronage structure and saw no operational justification for the consolidation that Camilla had proposed. His statement was brief and administrative, which was precisely its strength. It removed any suggestion that the opposition was personal. 3 senior royals had now rejected the proposal on institutional grounds. The weight of the room had shifted entirely against Camilla. Catherine spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. She did not address Camilla directly. She addressed the room. She said that she welcomed any conversation about improving how patronages were managed, and that she was open to discussions about coordination, shared initiatives, and more effective public engagement across all senior royal offices. But she said those conversations needed to happen between the people affected, not through proposals submitted without consultation. And then she added a sentence that several people in the room later described as the most precisely calibrated statement of the entire meeting. She said that she had never viewed the monarchy as a competition, and that she hoped no one else in the room did either. That sentence accomplished 3 things simultaneously. It rejected Camilla's proposal without attacking Camilla personally. It established Catherine's willingness to collaborate on legitimate reforms, and it framed anyone who continued to press for the consolidation as someone who viewed the monarchy as a zero-sum contest rather than a shared responsibility. It was a diplomatic masterpiece disguised as a simple statement of values. William finally sat down. The physical act of returning to his seat signaled that the confrontation was over, not resolved. Over, there is a difference. Resolution requires agreement. The meeting ended without agreement. It ended with the understanding that Camilla's proposal would not proceed, that the existing patronage structure would remain intact, and that any future proposals affecting the next generation's ceremonial authority would be submitted through proper channels with full consultation before reaching a formal meeting. Charles closed the session with a statement that was intended to restore order, but that inadvertently revealed the depth of the damage. He said that the family's strength had always been its ability to disagree privately while presenting unity publicly. He said that the meeting had tested that ability and that he expected every person in the room to honor the boundary between private disagreement and public division. It was a reasonable statement. It was also insufficient, because what had happened in that room was not a private disagreement. It was a structural confrontation between the current reign and the next one, between a queen consort fighting to preserve her influence and an heir fighting to protect his future authority. And the fact that it had erupted in a formal working session rather than a private conversation meant that the institutional machinery of the palace had witnessed it. Staff members had been present. Documents had been distributed and returned. The private secretary had recorded the meeting's outcomes. The confrontation was now part of the official record, however discreetly that record was maintained. Camilla left the meeting before anyone else. She did not speak to William or Catherine on her way out. She exchanged a brief look with Charles that witnesses described as communicating something between accusation and resignation. She collected her folder, now empty of the documents she had distributed, and walked to the corridor where her equerry was waiting. She did not discuss the meeting with her staff for the remainder of the day. Charles remained in the room after everyone else had left. He sat alone at the head of the table for several minutes. His private secretary returned to check whether the king needed anything. Charles asked him to leave the room exactly as it was. The chairs unstraightened, the water glasses half empty, the folded proposal still sitting in the center of the table where Anne had placed it. He wanted to sit with the evidence of what had just happened before anyone cleaned it away. William and Catherine left together. They walked through the private corridor toward the car that would take them back to their residence. Catherine asked William whether he was all right. He told her that he was not sure. She asked whether he regretted what he had said. He told her he regretted that it had been necessary. Then he said something that Catherine later repeated to a close confidant, and it is the detail that reveals more about the future king than anything else in this story. He said that his grandmother had never needed to raise her voice because the institution had never doubted who was in charge, and that the fact that he had needed to raise his suggested the institution was no longer certain. He told Catherine that certainty was the one thing a future king could not afford to leave in someone else's hands. The fallout inside the palace began within hours. Staff members who had been present during the meeting or who had been briefed on its outcome began making quiet calculations about their own futures. This is how institutional power actually works. It does not move through public statements or press conferences. It moves through the decisions of mid-level professionals who read the direction of the wind and adjust their loyalties accordingly. A senior aide in Camilla's household requested a private conversation with the king's private secretary before the end of the day. The aide did not say anything explicit. She asked a procedural question about reporting lines that would only matter if she was considering a transfer. The private secretary understood the signal and did not discourage her. Two junior members of the ceremonial planning team, who had been assigned to coordinate with Camilla's office on upcoming state events, sent a joint email to the Lord Chamberlain's department asking for clarification on whether their assignments had changed. The email was polite, professional, and entirely transparent in its subtext. They wanted to know whether working for Camilla's office was still a career-enhancing position or whether it had become a liability. The Lord Chamberlain's response was carefully neutral, which in palace communication is itself an answer. When a senior official wants to reassure you, they reassure you. When they respond with procedural neutrality, they are telling you to make your own judgment. Camilla noticed the shift almost immediately. The following morning, 2 briefing documents that normally arrived in her red box by 8 o'clock were delayed until nearly noon. When she asked her private secretary for an explanation, she was told that the documents had been rerouted through an additional review stage. No one told her who had ordered the additional review. No one needed to. The machinery was adjusting, not dramatically, not punitively, but with the slow institutional precision that the palace has perfected over centuries. Authority was not being stripped from Camilla, it was evaporating. The difference is critical because you can fight a decision. You cannot fight a climate. Charles spent the morning after the meeting in private. He canceled a scheduled call with the Prime Minister's office, which is extraordinarily rare. A sovereign canceling a communication with Downing Street signals that something inside the palace requires the king's undivided attention. His private secretary later rescheduled the call with an explanation that the king was attending to internal household matters, which is the constitutional equivalent of telling the government that the family needed a moment. Charles wrote a private letter to Camilla that morning, not a formal communication, a handwritten note delivered by hand to Clarence House. The contents have not been disclosed in detail, but household accounts suggest it contained 2 essential points. First, that Charles loved her and that their marriage was not in question. Second, that the proposal she had submitted had placed him in an impossible position and that she needed to understand why it could not be allowed to resurface in any form. The letter reportedly closed with a request rather than a demand. He asked her to trust his judgment even when it felt like a betrayal. That request, framed in the language of a husband rather than a sovereign, reveals the central agony of Charles's position. He cannot separate the man from the monarch. Every decision he makes as king lands on the woman he shares a bed with. Every boundary he enforces as sovereign feels like a wound he is inflicting as a partner, and the impossibility of holding both roles simultaneously without damaging one or the other is the weight that no coronation ceremony prepares you for. Camilla received the letter. She read it in the sitting room at Clarence House, the room where she takes her morning tea, the room lined with photographs from their decades together. She did not respond in writing. She called Charles's personal line. The call lasted 11 minutes. Neither of them has disclosed what was said, and no staff member was present for the conversation. But when Camilla emerged from the sitting room afterward, her private secretary noticed that the folder containing the rejected proposal was no longer on her desk. It had been placed in a locked drawer, not discarded, not destroyed, locked away. That distinction tells you everything about Camilla's state of mind. She was not surrendering the idea, she was preserving it, whether for future use, for historical reference, or simply because letting go of something you fought for is harder than admitting it was a mistake. The folder remained in her possession. William spent that morning differently. He went for a run on the grounds of Adelaide Cottage. Catherine joined him for the first mile, which is unusual because they typically exercise separately during the week. Staff who saw them described a couple walking back toward the house after the run in conversation that appeared serious but not strained. William was gesturing with one hand while holding his water bottle in the other. Catherine was listening, nodding at intervals, occasionally stopping him with a hand on his arm to say something that made him pause and reconsider whatever point he had been making. That dynamic, the heir processing a difficult decision while his partner challenges and refines his thinking in real time, is something that the public rarely sees, but that the palace staff have come to rely on. Catherine does not simply support William, she edits him. She catches the moments when his conviction tips into rigidity and pulls him back toward nuance without undermining his confidence. She catches the moments when his caution tips into inaction and pushes him toward decision without making him feel pressured. The relationship is not decorative, it is operational, and the monarchy's future stability depends on it in ways that no constitutional document will ever acknowledge. Later that afternoon, William placed a call to Princess Anne. The conversation lasted over 30 minutes, which is long for Anne, who famously prefers conversations that accomplish their purpose and end without lingering. William thanked her for what she had done in the meeting. Anne told him not to thank her for doing what was obviously correct. Then she gave him a piece of advice that by his own later account, he has thought about every day since. She told him that the most dangerous moment for any future king was not the crisis itself. It was the morning after the crisis, when the temptation to consolidate your victory was strongest. She told him that their mother had understood this instinctively. Elizabeth never pursued a defeated opponent. She never pressed an advantage beyond what was necessary to resolve the immediate problem. She won by restoring equilibrium, not by establishing dominance. And Anne told William that if he wanted his reign to carry the same moral authority that Elizabeth's had carried, he needed to resist the urge to follow up his confrontation with additional demands, additional restrictions, or additional demonstrations of power. He needed to let the decision stand on its own and allow Camilla the dignity of accepting it without being humiliated further. William listened. He asked Anne whether she thought he had gone too far in the meeting. Anne paused. Then she said something that managed to be both honest and kind at the same time, which is a combination she has spent her entire life perfecting. She told him that he had said things that needed to be said in a room where they needed to be heard, at a moment when silence would have been interpreted as consent. But she also told him that the volume had been unnecessary. The content was right. The delivery had given Camilla a grievance to hold on to, and grievances inside the royal family had a way of outliving the disputes that created them. She told him to be right more quietly next time. Catherine independently reached out to Camilla the following day. She sent a private note, handwritten through household channels. The contents were not confrontational. They were not conciliatory either. Catherine simply wrote that she respected the years Camilla had given to the institution and that she wanted to find a way to work together that honored both their roles without requiring either of them to diminish the other. She did not reference the proposal. She did not reference the meeting. She wrote as though the future was still open and the relationship between them was still something that could be built rather than something that had already been broken. Camilla did not respond to the note for 3 days. When she finally did, her reply was brief. She thanked Catherine for the gesture and said she hoped the sentiment was genuine. That response, guarded but not hostile, suggested that Camilla had moved from anger to watchfulness. She was no longer fighting. But she was not yet willing to trust. And honestly, given everything that had happened, that was probably the most realistic response anyone could have expected. Anne drove herself home to Gatcombe Park. On the way, she called Edward. The conversation was brief. She told him that the meeting had gone roughly the way she expected. Edward asked whether she thought the proposal would resurface in another form. Anne said it probably would. She said that power never accepts its own reduction gracefully, and that the only question was whether the next attempt would come through official channels or through the press. Edward asked what they should do. Anne told them to do what they always did: show up, do the work, and let the people who were busy fighting over titles and ceremonies explain to the public why they had time for politics but not for the job. Edward hung up and sat quietly for a while in his study at Bagshot Park. He later told Sophie that the meeting had reminded him of the worst family arguments from the 1990s, the era when Charles and Diana's war had consumed every room in every royal residence and turned the institution into a stage for personal grievances that should have been resolved in private. He said he had hoped that chapter was over. Sophie asked whether he thought it was beginning again. Edward did not answer, which was itself an answer. The palace press office spent the next 72 hours in containment mode. No formal statement was issued about the meeting because formally acknowledging a private working session would confirm that something extraordinary had occurred. Instead, the communications team deployed the palace's most reliable defense mechanism. Silence, complete, disciplined, institutional silence, no background briefings, no unnamed sources offering context to sympathetic journalists, no carefully worded statements that said nothing while appearing to say everything, just silence. The strategy was effective but imperfect because silence works only as long as everyone involved maintains it. And in a household employing hundreds of people, silence is a collective discipline that depends on the weakest link holding firm. The weakest link broke within the week. A detail from the meeting appeared in a London newspaper, not the full story, a fragment, a single sentence attributed to an unnamed palace source describing a sharp exchange between the Prince of Wales and the Queen Consort over ceremonial responsibilities. The sentence was accurate enough to be credible and vague enough to fuel speculation. It was the kind of leak that could have come from anyone present, anyone briefed afterward, or anyone who overheard a conversation in a corridor that was not meant for their ears. For their ears. The palace launched an internal inquiry. The source was never identified, which means either the investigation failed or the person responsible was too senior to be named. Charles addressed the leak privately with William. He told his son that the story would grow regardless of whether anyone added to it, and that the family's only viable strategy was to demonstrate unity at their next public appearance. William agreed on the strategy, but pushed back on the timeline. He told Charles that premature public unity would look performative if the underlying dispute was not genuinely resolved. Appearing together before the terms were settled would suggest that appearance mattered more than substance. And he reminded his father that the public had grown sophisticated enough to distinguish between genuine harmony and choreographed proximity. Charles considered this and conceded the point. The next joint appearance was delayed by 2 weeks, giving the private resolution time to solidify before the public performance began. When the family did appear together at a Commonwealth reception, every detail was calibrated to communicate stability without overplaying warmth. Charles and Camilla arrived together. William and Catherine arrived separately, but joined them inside. The four stood in a loose formation that photographers would interpret as comfortable, but that insiders recognized as carefully staged to avoid any image that could be cropped to suggest either closeness or distance between specific pairs. Anne arrived last, as she always prefers, and moved through the event with her usual efficiency, speaking to guests rather than posing for cameras, completing her obligations rather than performing them. The evening passed without incident, but later that night, as the cars departed and the building emptied, a member of the household staff found the event program that Camilla had been carrying. She had left it on a side table near the exit. Tucked inside the program was a small handwritten note in Camilla's hand. The note contained a single line. It read, "This is not how it ends." The staff member delivered the note to the king's private secretary, who read it, placed it in a file, and locked the file in his desk without comment. Whether that note was a promise, a warning, or simply the private frustration of a woman who believed she had been treated unjustly is impossible to know. But its existence confirmed something that everyone inside the palace already understood. The meeting was not a conclusion. It was a chapter. The proposal had been rejected. The confrontation had been survived. The public appearance had been managed. But the underlying tension between the current reign and the next one had not been resolved. It had simply been contained. And containment, as any engineer or any monarch will tell you, is not the same as repair. That assessment, delivered without drama or self-congratulation, captures something essential about the monarchy that the headline-driven coverage consistently misses. The institution does not survive because its members are brilliant strategists or gifted communicators or charismatic public figures. It survives because a small number of people inside it wake up every morning and do the work without asking what they get in return. Anne has done that for 50 years. Edward has done it quietly for decades. Catherine has done it since the day she married into the family. And William, whatever his frustrations, whatever pressure drives him to stand up in a meeting room and declare his authority before the crown has even touched his head, has done it with a consistency that his grandmother would have recognized and respected. The question this story leaves behind is not whether Camilla was wrong to submit the proposal. The question is whether the monarchy can survive the tension between the people who believe their position entitles them to influence and the people who believe their duty requires them to serve. Because those are fundamentally different visions of what the crown means. One says the institution exists to elevate the people inside it. The other says the people inside it exist to carry the institution forward. And every crisis, every confrontation, every meeting that ends with a folded document sitting in the center of an empty table comes down to which of those visions the family chooses to follow. So here is what I want you to sit with. Was William right to draw that line in front of the entire room? Was Camilla's proposal genuinely about service, or was Anne's silence the loudest answer anyone needed? And does Catherine's refusal to treat the monarchy as a competition make her the strongest person in this family, or simply the one who understands the game well enough to know that the best move is to refuse to play it? Drop your take in the comments. I read every one of them. And on a question with this many layers, I genuinely want to know where you land. Subscribe if you are not already with us, because this story is not finished. The next chapter is already forming. And when it breaks, we will be here to walk through every detail of it together.